Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Idahoan Show. If you follow other gun channels, I'm sure you've probably seen people talking about all of the drama surrounding this bill in Congress that might or might not remove suppressors from the NFA, and the sort of scandal about certain suppressor manufacturers allegedly petitioning Congress to drop that language and leave suppressors as NFA items, and then other people speculating about the economic impact of deregulating suppressors, with kind of the party line narrative being that if suppressors were taken off the NFA, that would just create a surge in demand as more people become interested and able in purchasing suppressors, and so all the suppressor industry needs to get behind this bill, and so despicable that any of them would be lobbying to keep them regulated, and so on and so forth. Well, personally, philosophically, I am all in favor of deregulating suppressors. I'm all in favor of repealing the NFA wholesale. It seems to me that the NFA flies in the face of the Second Amendment, making it an unconstitutional and hypocritical law, and as such, it is a national embarrassment that I would love to see eliminated. That said, as we work towards cleaning up our system of laws, we need to be circumspect about the economic impacts of changes that are made, because if people have a lot of financial stake in something, then that creates a barrier to reform that we need to be realistic about how we can remove that barrier in order to make progress. And looking at this from an economic standpoint, I think deregulation would have a massive impact on the suppressor market, reshaping the market in a way that would probably put a lot of manufacturers out of business. Now, to understand why and what that specific market restructuring would look like, I think our best bet is actually to look at the knife manufacturing industry. Knives at a national level are pretty much totally unregulated, much as suppressors should be. And they're also about the same level of mechanical complexity. You know, a knife or a suppressor could be a very simple, rudimentary device that's very inexpensive to fabricate. Or it can be a very exquisite device that has a lot of time and expertise and sort of artistry that goes into producing it. Now, at the bottom end of the market, there's a lot of knives available for sale that are dirt cheap, like less than $10. Most of those knives are probably pretty flimsy, they're probably not great knives, but they're cheap enough that they can be treated as disposable. They're easily replaced when and if they break. Then there's a wide selection of mid-range knives on the market that are a little bit better quality, but are still mass-produced at a scale where companies can take advantage of economies of scale and thereby furnish them to the customer relatively cheaply for what you're getting. And these might range anywhere from $15 to $150 or thereabouts, depending, of course, on the specific knife, the specific design, the materials, etc. And then there are the high-end custom knives, which are no longer mass-produced, at least not at a scale where the manufacturer could leverage economies of scale. Instead, these are handmade by knife makers, or in some cases produced by small businesses that are typically run by expert knife makers. And even if they have some standard designs, standard patterns of knives that they produce, every knife receives individual attention. There's a lot of individual craftsmanship that goes into the production of each individual knife. And because of that, the quantity of production is much smaller and the cost is much higher. So these high-end custom knives might go for anywhere from $200 to $2,000 on average. So now, just imagine what would happen to the knife market if the government passed a bill that suddenly made all knives NFA items. So in order to buy a knife, you have to fill out a bunch of paperwork, wait like a year for the government to process it, pay a $200 tax on the sale, etc., etc., etc. And the purpose of this thought experiment is not to get you all up in arms about how could they do such a thing. It's not to get you angry at the government. It's just to think about how this would change the market. Well, it seems to me that if that were to happen, low-end knives would completely disappear because nobody is going to go through a year-long paperwork approval process and pay a $200 tax to buy a $2 knife that's going to break in a month. Similarly, the mid-range sector is going to get hit pretty hard because a lot of the knives in that sector are differentiated mostly by price. You know, are you in the market for a $25 knife or are you in the market for a $125 knife? You know, that will sort of determine what you end up looking at. But if you add a $200 transfer tax to every knife purchase, then the difference between a $25 knife and a $125 knife in terms of price just kind of goes out the window. So a lot of people probably would just quit buying knives. Those that do purchase knives are going to be looking mostly at the higher end. Now, there's probably still quite a few knives in that mid-range spectrum that are good enough that people would consider, buying them even under those kinds of regulations if they needed a knife. However, the number of people that are going to buy those under those kinds of regulations is probably not enough to justify running mass production for just those knives. So in the short term, the mid-range knife market might struggle along for a while, but eventually I think we'd see that sector shut down as well, and large-scale mass production of knives would pretty much cease altogether. So that's going to leave high-end custom knives as the only surviving portion of the knife market, and that sector is actually going to boom because even though the knife market as a whole has contracted a lot, even though there's a lot fewer knives being purchased and a lot fewer people purchasing knives, there's still going to be a fair number of people who before were purchasing mid or even low range knives who now are driven to purchase high-end custom knives, first by the regulation itself and then by the collapse of mass production that eliminates the mid-range options. So bottom line, if knives were suddenly put on the NFA, large-scale mass production of relatively inexpensive knives would largely cease, but it would create a window of opportunity for more smaller companies, individual knife makers, to produce more high-end custom knives and sell them at prices where they could actually make a profit despite not being able to leverage economies of scale. In other words, if knives were put on the NFA, the knife market would start to look a lot like our current suppressor market, where an inexpensive suppressor might still retail for $500. And they're enough of a niche item that they're manufactured in relatively small quantities, usually by relatively small companies. And so, if suppressors were stricken from the NFA, if they were completely deregulated, I think we'd see the same changes in the suppressor market that we've just talked about in the knife market, but in reverse. Now, you would still have a market for high-end custom suppressors in the $500 to $2,000 price range, just as we have a market for high-end custom knives in that price range, because frankly, there are people that when they go to buy something, they want the very best and money is no object. Or they want something that's not just functional, it's a status symbol and they'll pay more for it just for the status of having something that's more expensive. But we would see a substantial contraction in that market sector, while we see explosive growth in the low to mid-range sectors that would start up basically from nothing. Now, it would take some time, obviously, for companies to start up and to get mass production rolling at a scale where they can leverage economies of scale. But long term, if suppressors were deregulated, I think we would see most suppressor sales being at price points around $100. I think you could build a very functional suppressor and sell it at a profit for $100 if they were not regulated. And so I think that's where most of the market would go, and that's probably going to squeeze a lot of the small businesses that are currently making suppressors and can't afford to scale up to take advantage of economies of scale and manufacture profitably at that price point, right out of business. Now, I don't know if there's any realistic chance of suppressors being deregulated by this bill or any other that may come up later. And by the time this video airs, the voting will probably all be said and done and it'll be old news. But if suppressors are ever deregulated, I would expect that the very highest end suppressor makers will probably be okay. You know, the guys that are making exotic designs from exotic materials and can credibly claim to have the best suppressor on the market, they probably won't see much change to their business. The ones that are making $500 suppressors to cater to the more affordable suppressor market, and don't have the capital to drastically scale up their production where they could leverage economies of scale and start offering that same suppressor or something of a similar design at a much lower price point, those guys are pretty much all going to go out of business. And in the meantime, there's going to be other startups or other large manufacturing companies that branch out into the market to provide a host of new suppressor options at much lower price points. You know, a mid-range suppressor, once the market has adjusted to deregulation, will probably be a little less than $100, not $500 to $1,000. And this, I think, sheds some light on, one, the difficulty of actually getting suppressors deregulated, and two, the moral dilemma that it creates for suppressor manufacturers. Because, you know, generally speaking, I think people that go into firearms manufacturing or producing accessories for firearms like suppressors tend to be pro 2A. You know, ideologically, they are people who love guns, they love freedom, and they would love to see these kinds of reforms take place. But if they've then gotten themselves into a situation where their livelihood depends on the regulation, now they have a dilemma of, do I follow my conscience and sacrifice my career? Or do I compromise my values in order to make a living? So that begs the question of, well, is there any way that we could deregulate suppressors without hurting a lot of these suppressor manufacturers? And I think the short answer is no. Market forces are what they are. If you deregulate suppressors, the markets are going to adjust. That said, there might be some ways, hypothetically, that we could sort of soften the blow or ease the transition to at least give people that are involved in that manufacturing a chance to adapt or to figure out what their next career move is, instead of just everybody getting blindsided. One option, of course, would just be to pass the deregulation but delay implementation so that there's a period of time for people to make those transitions. The trouble is, if you make that period of time long enough to actually make those transitions, like 5 to 10 years, then something politically is going to happen in that interim, and it's never actually going to get implemented. So I don't know how I feel about that. Maybe a better approach would be just to establish a temporary price floor. You say, okay, suppressors are hereby deregulated, but it's going to be illegal to sell a suppressor for less than $500. And then that $500 price floor gets lowered by $50 every year until 10 years from now it eventually goes away. In theory, something like that could create a gradual transition that would give people the time to adapt as needed. Another option, hypothetically, would be sort of a two-phased approach where you leave suppressors regulated for a period of, say, 5 years, but you eliminate the $200 transfer tax up front. And then that potentially would give the market a chance to adjust more gradually, where it does create some opportunity for lower end suppressors to enter the market, for companies to start to gear up mass production, and for that kind of market competition to reshape the markets at the upper end, but in a more gradual fashion, just because you still have to go through all the paperwork and approval and so forth. The trouble with that is that in that interim between the detaxation and the deregulation, you create kind of a political liability. And to understand what I mean by that, I think we need to take a step back and look at why the NFA isn't a bigger problem than it is. And the reason for that, as I see it, is that it only covers a relatively small niche of relatively exotic firearms and accessories, and the minority of people who own them, at least relative to American voters, American gun owners as a whole. I mean, the freedom to own firearms is one of the things that sets America apart as a truly democratic nation, in contrast to the many countries where firearms ownership, self-defense, anything like that is not recognized as a right, but is a special privilege that is conferred only at the government's discretion. Well, NFA items exist in a paradigm similar to that, where you have to get the government's blessing to purchase them, you're federally registered as the owner of that item, etc. Now, as long as there's only a handful of exotic items and a handful of people who own them that are subject to that paradigm, it doesn't pose too much of a threat to the exercise of American freedom as a whole. But if they were to broaden the scope of the NFA such that it covered most commonly owned firearms, or if they could just get the vast majority of American gun owners to purchase a duly registered NFA item that's already on the list, then they've effectually created a national gun owner registry, and they've shifted the ownership of firearms from the paradigm of freedom, from a fundamental right that we believe in, to now being a government-supervised privilege. And that's where I'm concerned that keeping suppressors on the NFA but removing the $200 transfer tax is kind of a well-disguised attack on gun rights. Because if you can bring NFA items within the financial grasp of just about everybody, then that brings you one step closer to getting everybody NFA registered, which, if that were to happen, puts us on the doorstep of abolishing the Second Amendment entirely. So I would strongly caution against that option. I would much prefer to see a phased implementation or just a price floor that decreases over time as a way to soften the transition, if we're ever able to make a transition like that happen in the first place. Anyway, there's my 2 cents worth on sort of the economic analysis of deregulating suppressors. Till next time, thanks for watching the Idahoan Show.